This week on the Writers Detective Bureau,
vehicle tampering clues, trademarks, and notice of warrant service.
I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau.
Welcome to episode number 96 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. And this week, I'm answering your questions about what kind of clues an investigator might find in a vehicle tampering, a question totally outside my expertise about trademarks and why sidebarsaturdays.com is the place to go, and then a follow-up question to last week's GPS warrant, having to do with notifying the car owner about the tracker. But first, big thanks to Gold Shield patrons Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, CC Jameson of CCJameson.com, Larry Keaton, Vicky Tharp of VickyTharp.com, Chris Ann, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli, Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com, Lynn Vitale, Marco Carocari of MarcoCarocari.com, Robert Mendenhall of RobertJMendenhall.com, Terry Swan, and Rob Kearns of KnightsFallPress.com for their support, along with my silver cufflink and coffee club patrons. You can find links to all of the patrons supporting this episode in the show notes at writersdetective.com/96. And to learn more about using Patreon to grow your author business or to support this podcast, check out writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. Hello from the fiery blazes of California, where nearly the entire state is on fire again. And it was 110 degrees today, which if you're from the much more sane parts of the world, that would be 43.3 degrees Celsius. So thanks for giving me a reason to stay inside with the air conditioning on. And can you believe we are 4 episodes away from episode 100? I feel like we're going to need to celebrate this. Not sure how. Maybe give away some mugs, do some behind-the-scenes stuff, maybe a live stream. I don't know. I would love to hear your suggestions. So whatever you have in mind for episode 100, send them to me at writersdetective.com/podcast. But enough about next month. You're here for this week's Q&A. Let's do this. Bella Elwood Clayton of debella.com.au writes, does tampering with someone's car, attempt to harm, happen in real life or mostly in movies? I read that it's often hard for investigators to find proof. Were they to, what kind of tampering leaves the most clues? Thank you. I'm pretty sure every action-oriented TV show of the 1980s, including my favorites, had an episode where someone's brake line was cut. Dukes of Hazzard, Chips, Rockford Files, MacGyver, and who can forget Bob and Doug's Van and Strange Brew? Take off, you hoser. Just like quicksand, it isn't nearly as common a life-threatening hazard as I'd anticipated it would be as a kid. And by the way, you can find a great page index of vehicular sabotage examples at tvtropes.org. It's a website I know I've mentioned before, but it's a great writing resource for becoming aware of common writing tropes, of which vehicle sabotage has its own page. The realities of malicious vehicular sabotage are that it's hard to know, right? Kind of like spotting someone wearing a wig. We only see the bad ones. So how many are getting past us? If you think about the typical problems you've had to deal with in your own car, how many are issues that could have been catastrophic? Brakes worn out, tires blowing out, or coming off the car altogether while you're driving? The list is probably endless. So by all means, don your chapeau de saboteur and have some fun. I haven't written a vehicle accident a vehicle accident report in over 20 years, but I do know one major change has happened since then, and that's the installation of EDRs in vehicles. Those are the black boxes. EDRs, or event data recorders, have come a long way in recent years as far as the data they collect. What data these EDRs do and don't collect vary by make and model of vehicle, but I will include a link in the show notes to an article about how fraud investigators are using crash data retrieval from EDRs to fight insurance fraud. And I'll link to it in the show notes at writersdetective.com/96. But be sure to research event data recorders and crash data retrieval to see what kinds of clue reveals you can believably write into your story. You can go well beyond finding a cut in the brake line. Your reader will likely think the culprit covered their tracks completely until they learn that not only did your protagonist solve the crime, they'll discover they likely own EDRs themselves. What do you mean you can tell how far back the driver's seat was at the time of the crash? Surprise! Joan Raymond of JoanRaymondWriting.com writes, "Love the recent podcast. It brought up other questions. Like, I thought when a warrant was served or used, they had to notify the recipient of the warrant. But in the case of needing a warrant to put a tracker on a car, would the paperwork be filed, but not shown to the car owner, which would ruin the whole reason for tracking? Maybe explain different warrants and how they work?" I would love to, Joan, and these are excellent questions. Last episode, we talked about how you need to get a court order or a search warrant signed by a judge to put a GPS tracker on a car. In past episodes, I've talked about how when you serve a traditional search warrant, like at someone's home, you leave behind a copy of the warrant along with a receipt of all the property seized pursuant to that warrant. And then a copy of that property list goes back to the judge. Well, technically the court clerk, but that property list goes back to the court as part of what we call a search warrant return. Basically saying, hey, judge, you issued this warrant that said go forth and search and seize. And then the return says we did that and this is what we took. Okay, it's more formal than that, but hopefully you get what I mean. So back to Joan's question. If we have to do that with a regular search warrant, don't we have to do that with court orders where the judge allowed us to install a GPS tracker? And if so, isn't that going to jeopardize the ongoing investigation? The answer is yes. We do need to inform the person of the GPS tracker warrant, but we don't have to do it immediately. In fact, we can petition the court to delay the notification. So if you want to go down the research rabbit hole on this, search Google for sneak and peek warrant or delayed notice search warrant. We actually rely upon the delayed notice warrants in a manner of ways. Under California law where I work, we have to petition the court in 90-day increments. So if the investigation goes on for 6 months to a year, you're going to have to go back to the judge and explain why you have sufficient reason to delay the notification. So when else would we want to delay notification? How about for phone tolls and cell phone billing records, where we're looking at a criminal organization like a DTO, a drug trafficking organization, and those phone records potentially map out the organization through link analysis. And then those phone tolls end up being part of the evidence that we use to get a wiretap going, which is another court order we want to delay notification on. So if the wiretapees know they're being listened to, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? Or how about that sneak and peek search warrant I just mentioned, where we're allowed to legally and surreptitiously search something, but not necessarily seize anything? I worked a narcotics case where the traffickers were using general aviation airplanes like small Cessnas to move dope. We got information that one of these planes was landing at a local airport and the pilot was going to meet someone. So we got a sneak and peek warrant to search that airplane without the pilot knowing, which is exactly what we did. Under cover of darkness, I'm out there on the airport ramp using my lockpick kit to open up this Cessna and record a video of this pretty good-sized stash of drugs in the back of the plane, and then get out of there before I got caught. Turns out that the dude the pilot was meeting actually came to the airport, so the pilot never actually left like we thought he was going to. We cut it so close on timing that I didn't have time to pick the door lock back closed again. Fortunately, I had a surveillance team watching the pilot, so when he started heading back out to the airplane, I got a heads up through my little radio earpiece and just took off running into the darkness. Fortunately, the pilot put his key in the lock and turned it, and apparently never even noticed that the door was unlocked still. Whew, okay, yeah, I was lucky. So if you happen to work at an airport and you find a lockpick kit in the grass early one morning, can I get it back, please? In all seriousness, sneak and peeks are kind of like being allowed to commit illegal burglary. You want an adrenaline rush? Go lockpick your way into a drug stash and get out before getting caught. So anyway, the plane takes off again, and with my evidence of that plane actually having drugs inside, it grew into a much larger investigation, even though I didn't actually seize anything. I just made a recording of it. Needless to say, I didn't leave a copy of the search warrant inside the plane. We were able to get the judge to delay notification of the warrant service until the end of the investigation. One thing I should mention about notifications on wiretaps is that everyone that is monitored on a wiretap gets notified. So if I own a tire shop and the target of a wiretap calls to make an appointment to get his tires rotated, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to get a letter from the investigating agency that I was monitored as part of a wiretap in the last X number of days. Would the wiretap monitors really bother recording and listening to a call to a tire shop? Actually, probably, especially if it's in the beginning of an investigation where everyone is in quote unquote unsub at this point, and the monitors are trying to determine if the call to the tire shop about needing a rotation or needing to buy 3 275 55 R20s is code for a transaction, or if the guy really needs to buy 3 tires. Really? Only 3? Lily O'Malley writes, I recently published an ebook, and halfway through the book, I have the police division contact the U.S. Coast Guard, and the two forces combine to do a drug interdiction at sea. They use Hitchron helicopters and the Hercules planes and the MH-60T helicopters, as well as various Coast Guard vessels in the scenes. I was looking at the U.S. Coast Guard websites again after I published to check a fact, and realized that the U.S. Coast Guard has registered a trademark and licensing on their name, as well as asking that if you portray them, to contact them. Is there an issue using the names of the different divisions of police departments and law enforcement agencies, or the Coast Guard and their aircraft and marine vessels by name in a published work? I tried contacting them about this issue, both on their Facebook media and on their own media relations email a few weeks ago, and no one replied. I quite often see the FBI and SWAT and Homeland Security portrayed in books without any acknowledgments. Is there a legal issue there that you've heard about? And then she included the link to uscg.mil/community/trademark. So, Lily, I found writer Matt Knight, Knight, who also happens to be an attorney that once specialized in intellectual property cases, has a website called Sidebar Saturdays. His blog post from May 20th, 2017 does a spectacular job of explaining how fiction authors can run afoul of trademark and intellectual property laws. And I will link to his Sidebar Saturday post, the one I'm referring to in the show notes, which you can find at writersdetective.com/96. Now, before I summarize and encourage you to read his full blog post, allow me to give my own legal disclaimer. This is not legal advice, and it's to be used for educational purposes only. In fact, you should consult an intellectual property lawyer in your jurisdiction for legal opinions specific to your situation and the works you're producing. Furthermore, since I am a duly sworn peace officer in the state of California, I am legally barred from providing legal advice. So let me be clear, this is not legal advice. Okay, with that out of the way, the key takeaways from Matt Knight's blog post are that you can't infringe on the trademark, meaning you can't confuse your readers into thinking your story is coming from the Coast Guard, or that they had any kind of affiliation or sponsorship of the story. So Lily, I'd avoid featuring any kind of Coast Guard logo or image of identifiable Coast Guard equipment on your cover without the express approval from the Coast Guard, just to be safe. The next concept that Matt covers is trademark dilution, like using trademark terms like Google, Xerox, or Kleenex, all capitalized in a diluted format, like lowercase Googling someone or Xeroxing a few pages of the library. In this case, be sure to capitalize the words Coast Guard in your story. And lastly, and I'd argue this is probably the most important one to take note of for your story, is Matt's topic of trademark tarnishment and defamation. You do not want to portray a trademark in a negative or disparaging way unless the work is either a parody or actually the truth. I know that the LAPD and Las Vegas Metro, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, among other police departments in the U.S., hold trademarks on their logos and their acronyms. Did you ever notice in CSI, on the TV show, their jackets always said LVPD and not LVMPD? And even on shows like Bosch or Southland, the badges they wear on screen are subtly different from the real trademarked LAPD badges. And before I get a bunch of emails and tweets, I've read that Dragnet and Adam 12 were the only fictional shows to use real LAPD badges. But as Abraham Lincoln famously tweeted, don't believe everything you read on the internet. I hope this helps, Lily. And again, be sure to check out Matt Knight's website, sidebarsaturdays.com. All of this insight into trademarks is purely his, so by all means, go do your deep dive there, and even better, talk to an attorney about intellectual property rights before you publish. Gold Shield patron Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com asked, Adam, the answers you give on your podcast are full of so many details. I'm curious, what question on your podcast required the most research for you to answer, and how much time was it? Talk about an incredibly timed question, Craig. Ironically, it was the one I just answered prior to this, because intellectual property law is quite outside my lane of expertise. And this one took me a few hours of reading to get a feel for whether I should even answer it. And as you just heard, I really just directed listeners to a real authority on the matter rather than trying to play the expert. I rarely do that, but I committed to answering the question before I really knew what I was getting myself into. Now, that said, the vast majority of the questions I answer are ones I have a pretty good handle on because of the experiences and training that I've had over the last 20-something years. Being a detective requires you to really understand the details of not only what we need to do, but why. And often that why is what I find most fascinating. The why may stem from a legal precedent, or it could be a hard lesson learned from a death, like when I talked about the Newhall incident a few episodes back. I've been fortunate to have worked a significant variety of assignments in my career. In addition to that, I used to teach cops from around California for our state's Department of Justice, and I still teach at the collegiate level. So when I answer these questions, I try to wear both my detective and teacher hats at the same time. The things that usually take the longest to look up are specific case law that apply to certain specific questions, but I usually don't have to research those all too often. And the other thing I have going for me is that I get to cherry pick which questions to answer. Sometimes I get questions that are more general ones about writing or publishing, and I usually just reply directly to the person who asked with a suggestion on where I would learn to go to learn more, like Joanna Penn's Creative Pen podcast or Mark Dawson and James Blatch's The Self-Publishing Show podcast for like indie publishing and author marketing questions, things that aren't really in my wheelhouse. When you decide to answer questions in any niche, you're going to get the same questions over and over. Everyone that finds you is at a different stage of the journey. And when they first find you, they haven't digested all of your content, obviously. So, and this is true for all niches. I mean, how many times has Gary Vaynerchuk answered questions about getting started as an entrepreneur? One of the pitfalls of doing this kind of question and answering can be getting irritated with this. I see it in Facebook groups all the time, which I understand, but I want to treat the Bureau as a brand, and I don't want a new writer that, or at least a writer that's new to me, that musters the courage to ask a question, knowing that they're here because they're looking for answers to something they're probably uncomfortable asking in the first place, at least the first time you find me. I want that first contact to be pain-free. You ask the question, and no matter how basic it may seem to a lot of people, you got a real answer that A, doesn't make you feel stupid for asking it, and B, lets you know that you're in a safe place to ask more questions. So if there's anything I hope my podcast, my Facebook group, and my brand in general represents, is that I'm not, well, hopefully not seen as some sort of annoying know-it-all. I mean, I have been called a fountain of trivial knowledge before, but I hope my brand represents a safe place to ask questions and get answers to both the very basic questions as well as the super technical. And when they are basic questions, like how many times have I talked about probable cause and search warrants on here, I use that as an opportunity to do a bit of a dive in a direction I haven't previously talked about while still answering the basic aspect of the question a second time, usually with a quick plug to the previous episode where I covered a similar aspect from the first time. All right, I know these podcasts are only 15 to 20 minutes each week, but I put a lot of thought and effort into what I'm going to say. Well, usually, and where I think it will be the most interesting and useful for you. So I hope I'm hitting my mark. And if I am, consider leaving me a review. That's a shameless plug, I know. And I'm not going to tell you what to do if you don't think so. So thank you so much for the question, Craig, and for the continued support. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening this week. This show is powered by your questions, especially as we get close to episode 100. Send those questions to me or tell me what you want to see in episode 100. Just go to writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week. Keep wearing those masks. Stay cool if you're here in crazy California, and write well.